Okay, so we're going to be talking about independent and dependent variables. So a variable, it is an empirical measure that can take on more than one value. So remember when we were talking about like quantitative uh, research methods, how we talked about the variable marital satisfaction. How would you rate your marital satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 10? That means the respondent can answer with anything between 1 and 10. So the responses can vary. Different people give different responses. Or another example, race. A person could be white or black or Native American or Hispanic or Asian, a variety of things. And so different people are still going to give different responses. So it's going to vary. So, some examples: IQ, age, marital satisfaction score, gender. All these things are going to vary depending on who is responding. So, there are two broad categories of variables. There is the independent variable and the dependent variable. The independent variable is thought of as the cause of the dependent variable. The dependent variable depends on what happens with the independent variable. So some other names of the independent variable include manipulated variable, treatment variable, predictor variable. And some other names of the dependent variable are criterion or outcome variable. So if you look over here, we have a visual. The independent variable leads to the dependent variable. So let's say I hypothesize that depression is going to impact marital satisfaction. So that's my hypothesis. So that means I think marital satisfaction is going to be impacted by depression. So that means depression is the cause or the independent variable. And then marital satisfaction is the dependent variable. It's going to vary depending on what happened with the independent variable. So let's try and identify the independent variables and the dependent variables here. So children's math scores were predicted by their father's level of involvement in their life. So I'm going to give you a few seconds, and I want you to try and figure out in your head which variable you think is the independent variable and which one you think is the dependent variable. Okay, so children's math scores was the dependent variable, and father's level of involvement was the independent variable. So that meant they think children's math scores was going to be impacted by father's level of involvement. Father's level of involvement was going to cause children's math scores. So this word predicted is important to hone in on. So the word predicted, the variable that is predicting or predicts is the independent variable. The variable that is predicted, predicted, is the dependent variable. Father's level of involvement predicts children's math scores. So it's important to figure out that word predicted. So let's talk about confounding variables. So there is a relationship in research between violent video games and aggression. The problem is that there could be a variety of confounding circumstances or variables, confounding variables. For example, what if it's rather than violent video games causing aggression, what if it's that people who are aggressive play violent video games? And so your control variable, you would want to control for the levels of aggression before before the video game. Or another example, what if socioeconomic status is impacting this? And I don't know this, but what if people who are lower in socioeconomic status are more likely to play video games and be aggressive. Maybe it's socioeconomic status that's causing both. And so that's another confounding variable. And so in studies, we come up with controls. These controls are the confounding variables. And when we include a control in a study, that means that we know that the relationship we found was not a result of the control, not a result of the confounding variable. So let's say we controlled for socioeconomic status in a study on video games and aggression. We would then know that the relationship we found between video games and aggression was not a result of socioeconomic status. We can rule that out. But if we don't include it in the study, then we have no idea if it's actually playing a role in this relationship, and we're claiming this relationship when maybe the relationship is not what we're thinking it is. There's something confounding, and we didn't account for it by putting it in our study. So, control variables, they are a special type of, they predict the dependent variable, and so in some ways they're kind of an independent variable as well, but not the main independent variable, not the independent variable we usually talk about when we say independent variable. So we usually talk about the variables as independent variable and controls, even though the controls kind of act as independent variables too, because they predict the dependent variable. So controls are there to help us isolate the relationship between our independent and dependent variable. They're there to help us make good conclusions rather than concluding a relationship when maybe our relationship doesn't make any sense because there's something else accounting for that relationship. So those are independent variables, dependent variables, and controls.